I'm Jessica Bronzert, and I'm delighted to share some content around vertical or adult development with you today. This is something that I learned about when I did my coach training and that I've been very interested in and studying for quite some time. Vertical development or adult development is the idea around how humans grow and change in adulthood and how that has impacts for leadership and business results in our organizations and in society at large. I hope you enjoy what I'm about to share with you and look forward to talking to you on the back end. The leadership opportunity and the leadership problem are essentially the same thing. This is a sort of a representational graph from some of the research describing what is known as the complexity crisis. That is the problem and the opportunity. And what this is indicating, this line here is a representation of the task demands that are being put on leaders at increasingly higher levels of leadership. So you can see we start with supervisor, we go all the way up to senior leaders. And the red bars here are indicative of what leaders at that level are able to bring to the table in terms of meeting those task demands. And so what you should immediately notice is what? Yeah, the higher you go in leadership, the bigger the gap is between what is expected for you to be successful and what people at that level are able to bring. So this is research from an organization called Lectica, and they have reproduced this research in the for-profit sector, in the nonprofit sector, in the government sector. Basically everywhere they look, they're finding this gap that the complexity of what we need to deal with at increasing levels of leadership is not something that we're able to meet as we rise in the ranks, okay? And so what is this idea of complexity? So we sort of intuitively know when something is complex, but I want to offer you a couple of different ways to look at it today. So two definitions. One of them is cause and effect, or the degree to which cause and effect is linear, and we can kind of see what the cause is and what the effect is when it's obvious, and whether or not we're able to see it ahead of time. So when things get more complex, they're not linear. It's not obvious maybe how cause and effect are connected, and we're not necessarily able to predict it ahead of time. We might be able to see it in hindsight. And so one of the examples I'd like to use of this is 9/11. When 9/11, immediately in the aftermath of 9/11, it was very chaotic, right? We really didn't know what had happened, and it took us a long time to figure out what the causes had been that led to the effects that we experienced. So that's an example of something that even goes beyond complex into chaotic. Another way of thinking about complexity is this idea of problems and polarities. And so much of how we think about challenges that we face is that they're problems to be solved, and that once we deal with them, they're done and we can kind of move on. But when things get more complex, what they really are dilemmas to be managed. They're not problems that are going to be solved. And so an example of that is I do a lot of coaching with leaders who bring up work-life balance, right? There's probably not anybody who hasn't had a thought about work-life balance at some point. And the trap that we fall into is thinking that if I solve the problem of work-life balance, then it's done, I'm set. When really it's a polarity, it's a dilemma. I have work and I have life, and I want to maximize the benefits of both of those things and minimize the disadvantages of both of those things. So it's a really more of a polarity that I need to manage over time as opposed to a problem that I'm going to solve and be done with it, right? And so when we think about the world getting more complex, business getting more complex, we're kind of talking about either cause and effect or this idea of polarities. So I just want to give you a quick taste of like, okay, when we talk about complexity, what do we mean? And the impacts of this complexity that we see more and more are pretty significant. So IBM runs a study pretty frequently, I don't know if it's every year, every other year, where they survey CEOs, and 80% of the CEOs in their study report that complexity is the single biggest issue that they face in their business. Henley Business School reports that $237 billion of profits are lost annually by the top 200 companies in the US due to complexity. And on a personal level, when we are in over our heads, when we are experiencing more complexity than we can individually handle, we experience stress. And we know that you as HR professionals, we all know that stress is a huge epidemic. The World Health Organization is saying that this costs American businesses up to $300 billion a year. So I want to sort of put forward this idea that complexity and change are a significant issue with significant implications, and it's something that leaders are thinking about. So I want to give you just a minute to turn to whoever you're sitting next to and bring this idea of complexity into your own business, or think about it from your perspective, what you're seeing in your business. So where's the complexity coming from? It could be coming from market conditions, could be coming from business disruptions, could be coming from new product or service introductions, big change initiatives, growth, lots of different places. So just take, I'm just going to give you a minute to talk to your partner about where is this complexity thing showing up in my business or in my job. Okay? If it was hard for you to come up with something, I would be really surprised. It is everywhere when you stop and think about where complexity is coming from. And that's basically, sort of where I want you to get to with that. So let's keep trucking along here. What all of that complexity means is that we have a huge leadership development imperative. That essentially is the leadership development imperative. And so Bob Anderson and Bill Adams are two of the current day writers and thinkers in this space. And I love this quote from them. The development of leadership effectiveness must, at a minimum, keep pace with the rate of change and the rate of escalating complexity, okay? And current efforts are insufficient. So one of the other big thinkers in this space is Nick Petrie from the Center for Creative Leadership. He's out of the Colorado Springs campus. And he puts a finer point on it. Most leaders already know what they should be doing, but what they lack is the personal development to do so. So he's drawing a distinction between sort of the intellectual or the rational understanding of what the things are that I need to be effective and my ability to actually show up that way or embody it or be effective doing it. Is that making sense to everybody? Okay. And so what I want to offer you today is this idea around vertical development as one of the best antidotes that we have in response to this complexity and this leadership development imperative. And so what is vertical development? How should you think about it? I want you to think about it as the operating system on your smartphone. So everybody's got a smartphone, and what can I do? I can add apps to that thing all day long. I can make it be a calculator, a phone. I can do my banking. I can make a phone call on it. I can do all this stuff, right? My kids have like 20 bajillion games on my phone. And I can do that, but what's going to happen if I just keep adding apps to my phone? Eventually, it's going to stop working. Like, it'll fill up, it'll slow down. And if I'm going to solve that problem, what do I need to do? I need to upgrade the operating system. And so I offer that to you as a metaphor for the distinction around what I'm going to show you as horizontal development and vertical development. So vertical development is the idea that we are working on our operating system and not on our apps, okay? It is how we make meaning in the world. What is the lens that we look through as we take in what's happening around us and decide what to do? And many people call it, essentially our level of consciousness, that over time as adults, our level of consciousness can grow. And obviously Einstein's quote sort of hits the nail on the head here. I won't read that to you, everyone knows that one, but that's essentially what Einstein is getting at is vertical development. He probably didn't have that term for it though. And so we can think about these two kinds of development, horizontal development and vertical development. You can think about another metaphor here is a cup of water, that when I'm working on horizontal development, I'm adding skills and competencies to my toolkit, which is critically important. So I'm not here to dismiss competency models or skill development, but I do want to make the case to you that as we grow in our leadership roles to more senior places, it becomes less about our technical expertise, less about our skills and competencies, and more about our container, more about our level of consciousness, more about our operating system and our ability to navigate that complexity that we're experiencing and that we're seeing in business, okay? So vertical development is the idea that it is about how we think. So if I'm developing horizontally, I might be pouring water into my cup, but if I'm developing vertically, my cup might be getting bigger, okay? So horizontal development, what I know, vertical development, how I think. So pretty, big distinction here in the kinds of development we could pursue. It is not personality, competence, behavior, job position, intelligence, or socioeconomic status, okay? We find people who are very highly vertically developed, who have had, very difficult circumstances that they've been brought up in, who are not in corporate America, who are leading completely different lives, and vice versa. Okay, so it's really not correlated to any of those things. Okay, I'm going to turn you loose again for another rapid fire partner discussion. Hopefully you've gotten a really quick taste of the distinction between horizontal development and vertical development. I guarantee that all of you have experienced both kinds of development. And so what I want to invite you to think about for just a quick minute is when, under what circumstances, have you experienced horizontal development and when have you experienced vertical development? So here's an example. I'm going to a class next week on this topic. I'm going to continue deepening in this space, and I'm going to get some tools and tricks and tips on how to coach through this vertical development framework. So I'm going to be pouring water into my cup next week. When I left Lowe's to go out on my own and I stopped working for an employer and I started working for myself, my entire identity had to shift, and I had to make meaning about my work in a completely different way than when I was inside a company. That was vertical development. There was also horizontal development. I had to learn how to do QuickBooks, and I had to learn how to write a contract, and there was a whole lot of horizontal stuff going on, but the bigger shift was vertical at that point in time. Does that make sense to everybody? So buddy up with a person next to you for just 1 or 2 minutes and talk about horizontal and vertical development in your own life. All right, good. So I'm hoping, we're moving really fast and we're skimming across the top of all this today, but I hope you've got a little bit of a distinction around, gee, I have experienced this, and this is maybe when in my life I've experienced it. All right, so now I want to get into the academic wonky part and teach you about one of the vertical development models. So a few things about this. It is highly researched and evidence-based. It is a psychological construct. So it used to be that psychologists believed by the time we were 18 or 21 that our psychological maturity, our development was kind of done. We weren't going to grow anymore. And in the last 50 or 60 years, Jane Levenger, Robert Keegan, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, that's who I'm learning from next week, Bill Torbert, some of these thinkers have really said, hey, we believe that psychological development continues on into adulthood. And by the way, we think that it's really relevant when you bring it into the organizational setting and look at leadership effectiveness. That's partly why this is so cutting edge and kind of new, and why most of us haven't heard about it, is that it really is being borrowed from the field of psychology and brought into organizational life. It is unidirectional, so when you see this model, you're probably going to see a stage that you're like, oh, if I could be there, if I could get my leaders here, we're just going to do everything from that stage. And that is not how this works. You can't send people to a class to grow vertically, because it's more based on getting in over your head and having your perspective challenged. So you move through this model unidirectionally, one stage after the other. You keep everything that came before. So you can still go back and make meaning from the stages that precede the one where you might currently be making meaning from. Center of gravity, so everybody has sort of one stage where they're most comfortable making meaning from most of the time, but we are able to reach back, and occasionally we can kind of reach forward. So in any given situation, you might see people kind of making meaning from a different place. When we're stressed, we tend to regress, okay? And language is important, so there is no judgment associated with any of the stages. Every stage of adult development has value, has advantages, has disadvantages or limitations to it. So we do not say higher or lower. We prefer the language earlier and later. So earlier stage, later stage is a way to draw distinctions. And the critical consideration here from a leadership perspective is we're very interested in the fit between what the leader is asked to do and where they are making meaning, right? So back to that complexity crisis, that gap that I was showing you on the very first slide, that's really, we want there to not be a big gap, okay? All right, so here's one of the models that is out in the world around this. This one comes from the Center for Leadership Maturity. It's where I'm taking my class next week. We have 3 major stages here: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. This is on the back of your handout if you want to be looking at that. And these are the stages that we're gonna talk through pretty quickly. And what you can see is the percentage of leaders that tend to fall in each of these stages. So very few people as adults are in that self-centric, pre-conventional stage. Most of us as adults are sitting in this conventional meaning-making space, okay? We're going to spend a lot of time talking about this. And then some people do cross over, but not very many, into these post-conventional stages of meaning-making, okay? And I'll explain why it's kind of important, or a problem, or an opportunity for us that only about 15 to 20% of the people make it here, okay? I bet you can tell. Like, where is leadership effectiveness going to live? Transformational change is going to live here, okay? All right. Self-centric. Not very many people that we know would be sitting in this stage, but maybe some of you will be able to think about somebody. This is somebody who likes to win any way possible, very oriented around getting their own needs and desires met, sort of at all costs. Might makes right. So if I'm stronger than you, if I have more power than you, I'm going to go ahead and use it to get what I want. That's kind of how people at this stage look at the world, and can be very manipulative at this stage, okay? So advantages, why this stage might be a good place to be. People who are at this stage are really good at sales, right? Go out and win the deal, okay? The disadvantage is that this is not highly correlated with leadership, right? This is not very participative or consensus-oriented. It's not collaborative necessarily. So that would be a major disadvantage. Now, again, less than 5% of the leaders that we see would be sitting in this stage. And can anyone think of anyone? And I'm not asking about the US government. So a couple of hands go up, right? Most of us hopefully are not seeing this in our workplaces too much, okay? Here is a cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes that kind of illustrates this. I'll read it out loud in case some of you in the back can't see it. I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it was right or not. Shoves him. Hey! Why'd you do that? You were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justify the means. I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt. Just me. All right, so this is a funny, Calvin and Hobbes is so great, a great representation of sort of what that self-centric, childlike, So some of our teenagers maybe a little bit, right? So this is sort of in that transition from teenagerhood to early adulthood might be where we would see a little bit of this, okay? All right, that's self-centric. We're going to keep going into group-centric. So this might be about 10% of the adult population sits in this stage, so a few more people. Some of the hallmarks of this is very much about being identified with the group, okay? So I want to belong to a group. Loyalty is a fundamental value when I'm at this stage. My power comes from my affiliation with the institution or with the group. My identity comes from that, okay? I really like my relationships to be smooth and everything to be kind of copacetic. I'm not a huge fan of change at this stage because that might put the smooth relationships at risk, right? Does that make sense? Saving face is something we're really thinking about when we're at this stage. I really want to look good, really want my boss to look good, I really want everyone else to look good. And if you're part of my group, if you're part of that identity that I identify with, then you're part of us. And if you're not, anywhere on the outside, I sort of look at you as a them. I look at you as them. I coached somebody who was at this stage, and his leadership was really giving him too much work to do. His workload was excessively high, and what he needed to do was have a conversation with his boss about his workload. He was completely unwilling to have that conversation because he did not want to put the relationship at risk. And his identity as part of the team and as part of the company, in his mind, was that he would be trading that off if he were to give his boss negative feedback about how he was being treated in the organization. It was more important to him to maintain loyalty and to maintain a smooth relationship with his boss than to actually address the issues that were on the table and make change. Does that make sense to everybody? SkillCentric. So when we move forward to SkillCentric, we really start to become identified with our subject matter expertise, our ability to solve problems, our ability to see the solution to things. So when I get here, I want to stand out and be unique. So I've sort of moved past that loyalty piece from the earlier stage. Now I want to be recognized for my specialness, my skills. These are people who are really identified with, craft logic, specialists, technicians. So we have about 30 to 40% of the adult population sits in this stage as their center of gravity. So we should either identify with this, or we should be able to think about a lot of people who are at this stage of meaning making, okay? And a lot of our roles in organizations need this, right? We need people who are technicians and specialists for a lot of the work that we have in our organizations, okay? I can be a perfectionist when I'm here, want things to be, on, really like to have the answers. However, on the more limited side, everything is important to me, so I might have more of a challenge prioritizing. And because I think I'm the smartest person in the room and I have all the answers, in a leadership role, I'm going to have a little bit more of a tendency to micromanage somebody else because they just don't know as much as I do. They just don't know as much as I do, okay? And our humor here at this stage can be kind of sarcastic and hostile at times. So a little bit of a biting sense of humor. So anyone know anyone who fits this description? IT guy. Could be. Yeah, I mean, you think about so many of our professions. I actually wouldn't put HR in this category because we have to bring so many diverse skills to the table that really being a specialist I don't think is totally identified with HR. But you think about doctors, lawyers, accountants, IT folks, where you really do need this deep subject matter expertise to do the job well, really attracts people who are at this stage of making meaning. So there is a tremendous amount of value in looking at the world this way because we need people who are confident in their abilities and confident in their ability to solve problems. However, this stage of meaning making is not positively correlated with leadership. Why? If I'm the smartest person in the room, I really am not doing too well working through other people, am I? That's the fundamental leadership limitation of this stage, is that I really am not giving a lot of credence to other people at this point, okay? All right, trucking along here, self-determining. This is the other really big stage where most of us are sitting as adults. So what happens is I'm sitting at SkillCentric, I'm feeling pretty good that I'm smart and I can get a lot of stuff done, but I realize actually that if I'm not working through other people, then I'm not getting as much done. I might be right, I might think I'm right, but am I really getting the results that I want when I can't collaborate and I can't influence and I'm kind of, occasionally whacking people over the head with my expertise? And so people then shift to self-determining, which is very much about sort of there is an answer out there, and if we work really hard, we can get it. And so the other name for this stage is called achiever. So think of like achieving, running really hard, getting a lot of stuff done. You could almost argue that Western culture, business culture in the United States is really identified with self-determining, right? If we were to have a stage as a country, this might be it. Work really hard and you can have anything you want, right? So we're focused here on successful plans and outcomes. We really believe that there are answers, so we're not totally on board with this idea of polarities yet, right? The idea that there isn't a right answer, that there might be a dilemma we have to manage. So we're still not doing too well managing complexity at this stage, okay? We're very driven to accomplish things. We're open to learning and feedback because now we're really interested in getting stuff done. And so if I could do something differently to help get the thing done, I want to know. But at the previous stage, I'm not so interested in feedback because I'm already the smartest person in the room. So what could you possibly offer me that is going to help me get better? Does that make sense? And then we are more open to prioritizing and figuring out where we need to be spending our time and energy as we move forward to this stage. Okay, so you start to see a little bit better time management here. But then people are just working so hard and trying to get so much done. So between self-determining and self-questioning is a pretty significant leadership transition. What happens at self-determining can be, for some people, burnout. You're running so hard, you're getting so many things done, but you realize that you will just keep going forever and ever and ever if things aren't different. And so this is sometimes when we sort of see people have a midlife crisis, is how we refer to it in pop culture. people begin to question, why am I doing this? Is this ever going to end? Is my value just in what I produce and just what I can do? Is there any different way for this to be? And that is what leads people into this big transition. So up until this point, we really make meaning from the outside in. I'm looking at my family, I'm looking at society, I'm looking at my employer for information on what success looks like and how I should be living my life. The big shift from self-determining to self-questioning is sort of deconstructing all of those outside influences and reconstructing them from the inside out. Okay, I see what all of those outside inputs are, but what are my values and what would it look like to construct my life in accordance with my values? That's what begins to happen here, is the deconstruction part, okay? So we have an increased value placed on complexity. The complexity really starts to come online at this point. Able to make things object. So we talk about subject and object. The way I explain this is that I'm highly subject to chocolate. I see it, I eat it. I don't think about it. I am subject to it. If I was able to make chocolate object, I would be able to see the tray of brownies on my kitchen counter and think, put enough of a space in there to have a conscious thought about whether or not I should eat the brownie and make a decision. Make a decision, as opposed to just like seriously not even thinking about it and putting it in my mouth. And so you expand that out to the rest of our lives. When we are able to make things object, we are sort of able to be the fly on the wall, or to put the thing in our hand and kind of walk around it and take a look at the situation and have a little bit more conscious thought about what we want to do with it. We are not so subject to it, okay? That really starts to come online at this stage, being able to make things object, decide if you're going to eat the brownie or not. I'm still struggling with that, by the way. We begin to really test our beliefs and our assumptions here. We become more comfortable with paradox, right? That idea that we can have two conflicting ideas that are both really good and don't make sense together. And a big shift from doing to being here, okay? So the idea that, oh, if I could just be instead of do, what would that look like? Okay? Self-questioning. Self-transforming is the next stage. So with self-questioning, we're also very interested in egalitarianism. We sort of think everything is equal. We've been assigning some judgments before at earlier stages about working hard or being the expert. And in self-transforming, we sort of come back around to that. We really like people-oriented, inclusive, constructive perspectives. Very interested in feedback from multiple perspectives at this point. Collaboration, communities of practice, personal development. This is huge. So how many of you are familiar with Blanchard's situational leadership model? The idea that you can adjust your leadership style to meet the needs of the people you're leading. This model says that you can't actually do that until you get to the self-transforming stage, which to me is a really interesting question that, you know, we're out there using Blanchard stuff saying, well, you should be no big deal to adjust your management style to meet the needs of your folks. From a psychological point of view, we're saying that doesn't come online until pretty late in the game, okay? And our humor shifts here to be lighthearted and more existential. This is the stage that is most highly correlated with achieving and sustaining transformational change, leadership effectiveness, and business results. Less than 5% of the adult population gets to this stage of development. And so that is the leadership development opportunity, or the leadership development imperative, is to help more people get here so that we can reap the benefits of what they're able to do, okay? And the last stage is construct aware. So think about Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. So this is deep wisdom, humility, lightness, able to transform themselves, organizations, and society. So you can think about some of those really big change agents out in the world. I love this. The knack for doing the right but surprising thing at the right moment. I would love to be able to do that. Often social catalysts and visionaries who are at this very late stage. Less than 1% of the adult population ever gets here, okay? Here's a quote from MLK. So social justice starts to come online a lot at these much later stages. You know, what are you doing for others, okay? So why does this matter? Why did you come to this session? Here's what we know Corporate and individual performance does vary according to stage of development, okay? Self-centric and group-centric leaders in particular are significantly less effective than self-determining leaders. So we do start to see a better correlation with leadership at that achiever stage. So self-determining leaders do better, but only post-conventional leaders have consistent capacity to innovate and transform, okay? And one of the studies that's shown this, I put in a box over here, 21 CEOs, 21 promising middle managers, each with fiscal responsibility of at least $5 billion. Across a range of leadership measures, there is a clear correlation between higher levels of vertical development and higher levels of effectiveness, okay? So you're probably like, well, great, I've bought into this idea that vertical development is important, but if I'm leading leadership development in my organization, what the heck am I supposed to do with this stuff? So Nick Petrie at Center for Creative Leadership is doing some of the best work around what vertical development looks like and how you can incorporate it into your leadership development programs. Here are the big headlines, okay? We need people to have heat experiences where they get in over their head and they have to figure out new ways of making meaning in order to make sense of the situation they find themselves in, okay? The new role that you mentioned, starting your own business, whatever the case is, those are the kinds of experiences that leaders need. They need to face a complex situation that disrupts their habitual way of thinking. Then they figure out, oh shoot, the way I've been doing it is not gonna work anymore. Then they need some help. They need to be exposed to people who have different perspectives than them, can help them look at it in a different way, in a new way, and begin to say, oh, okay, here's some alternatives to the way I've been thinking about it or the way I've been doing it. What are some of the possibilities here? How might somebody else look at this? And then in the third step, coaching or some kind of a process to integrate all of that together and help the leader make sense of what they're experiencing and getting different perspectives into a new way of making meaning, okay? Into a new way of making meaning. So these kinds of components can be incorporated into existing leadership development programs. And a lot of the things you might already be doing probably fit the bill. Action learning, stretch assignments, promotional opportunities, obviously. So chances are you're already doing some things in your organization that promote vertical development. What might it look like to be a little more intentional about this? Thanks so much for joining me for our session on vertical development. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and I invite you to reach out to me for more information and to continue the conversation. Thanks so much.